I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience and how I came to have this implant. Although my implant is now 20 years old and I'm conscious that things have moved on quite a bit, nevertheless, I would like you to understand some of the things that happened to me. First of all, my deafness wasn't hereditary. I lost my hearing quite suddenly. I was working at an art centre at the time, and I fielded a phone call from my aunt who said that last night, did you know your mother died? And I just couldn't understand that, couldn't believe it. I screamed, I dropped the phone, and I had to be driven home. I was so shaken up. Now, between that phone call and my mother's funeral 2 weeks later, my hearing threshold just dropped. So I had the tiny ones inside my ear, then the flat ones, then behind the ear, till I ended up with a body-worn one, and that became useless also, so that when we had the funeral of my mother, I couldn't hear anything that they were saying about my mum. When I went to the hospital at QE, they gave me a CAT scan because it was said to me that if you lose your hearing that suddenly, it could indicate that you have got some sort of tumour. However, the CAT scan showed, as Mr. Proops told me, everything looked normal. So they couldn't understand why I could no longer hear on both sides. It was a time that I was really, really down about this. I believe in anybody's money. I went through some form of nervous breakdown. I just couldn't cope with not being able to hear. And I thought, the only thing now is I won't be able to work and look after myself. All my friends who I had, because I was quite sociable, a number of them, sadly, because of my hearing loss, were embarrassed that I couldn't hear them and they would have to write notes down. So I saw less and less of my friends at the time and only kept a few real friends. I had two sons who were quite young, and they were about 7 and 10. And they used to play tricks on me by making noises in the living room. And when I came to see them, they'd be sat there as good as gold. And I used to wonder, how come they are behaving like I could hear an uproar? And it wasn't until years later they told me that my hearing aid was whistling, so they could always hear my whistling as I came to them, and that's when they knew to behave themselves. But the time came where I felt that I couldn't stay as I was. I didn't want to be deaf. There were some people who my sister had prayer meetings thinking I could get my hearing back if I prayed hard enough. Sadly for me, it didn't work. So I had to rely on what my doctors had said. And at the time, I didn't feel I had much of a choice. I either had the operation or stayed deaf. That was a simple fact. I decided that I would have a party with the friends. I know it seems a bit down now, perhaps daft, but I wanted, before going into the hospital, to see the people closest to me so that they could understand why I decided to have the operation. The operation had been spelt out to me and what the risks were, but that they felt that I could benefit in some way by having this. But as I say, I didn't feel I had much choice, as I didn't want to stay deaf and I wanted to be able to work for myself. And so I decided to go along with this and had this party. And then when I told my boys that the next day I'd be going into for the operation, and I got very weeping and crying and telling me, Dad, no, don't have it done. But I felt that I didn't have a choice. And so I was so convinced that this operation wasn't right for me, or that it would be fatal for me, that on the day of admission, Mr. Proops, who did the operation, came to see me. And I was there writing on my bed, And he asked what I was writing. And I said, look, it's got nothing to do with you, really. It's not I don't have confidence in you. It's just that I don't think I'm going to survive this operation. And so I'm making out my will. And he just looked at me with a little grin and went off. I had the operation, that was a Monday, I remember well, and I went into the theatre at about midday. My operation took 5.5 hours, which these days it's done in around about 2 or less, and people are discharged either that day or the next morning. In my case, I had to stay in hospital for 5 days while they then x-rayed the implant to see that it was in the right position, etc. And I couldn't wait then to get home. On the day I recovered from the operation, I remember it well because I have contact lenses and I had a big bandage on my head. And so I couldn't see, I couldn't hear. And Mr. Proofs was hovering over me, asking me, how did I feel? And I thought, what do you think I feel? I said to him, well, for one thing, I've survived the operation, so you failed. And he went away. And then I had the x-rays, as I said, and went home. And a month later, I had to come back and see Stuart Burrell, who was going to switch the implant on for me. I had, of course, been to the hospital to have the packing and the stitches and that out in the meantime. And when it was connected to the computer and switched on, I could hear the beeps, which are the test beeps that they put through. But then when Stuart switched it to the microphone and started to talk to me, I just devastated I was. I couldn't believe it. His voice sounded like one of these cartoon characters, but speaking underwater. And I just couldn't make out what he was saying. And I started to cry. Then I got very angry. And I said to him, look, I've had enough of this. You all said I would hear better, and I can't. And he was saying to me just to calm down and give it a chance. And I just stormed out the hospital. And I went home really annoyed. And I thought, this is it now. I've the one chance I had of hearing again, and it's gone. At home, later that evening, I decided that I would put it on again, the implant. And I sat there, and I could hear this noise. I was looking towards my kitchen, and I could hear my washing machine going through the spin cycle, and I hadn't heard that at all since I'd been deaf. I was absolutely amazed. And I went in the kitchen, and I'd put the kettle on, and again I sat down to test myself, and I could hear the kettle click off. I could even hear myself wee. And these are all little things, but they were important to me because they made me realize just how much I had lost in terms of what I could hear, because I think the deafness was a gradual thing, really, over that 2 weeks. So that was what life was like then. I had the operation, and within 3 days, because I went back to the hospital, for some reason, it suddenly just clicked. And I could understand what Stuart was saying to me. And I then was booked to have speech therapy with Patrick and a couple of others. And that's how my experience was of having the implant, etc. I would really love to talk to you now about my work now, because I work for social services and I work as a home care manager. That means I manage the staff of 41 staff who go into people's home and do what used to be called home helps. And the important bit about that is that clearly I need to communicate, and especially on the phone or in group setting with the teams or at meetings. And it's that rare difference of having my implant that allows me to do all of that. In fact, I'm very proud of my implant. I don't obviously sleep with it, on, and at home, I don't always keep it on. If I'm on my own, I like to be able to just have the silence. But I'm pleased I have the choice that the implant gives me. And then if my phone flashes, then I will put the implant on and take the phone call. So in terms of, for me, having the implant has made a major impact on my life. I certainly couldn't work at the sort of job that I have, where I have to use telephones. I even use a mobile phone with a Bluetooth link to my implant. So when I'm at the office, they can reach me. So I rely on this implant totally. And even when I've been given additional support, such as lip reading or lip speaking or signing, I still fall back on using my implant. Without it, I just wouldn't have the sort of quality of life that I have now. I'd like to tell you a little bit now about the time from the switch on of my implant to me actually using the implant to enable me to work. Because the switch on, as I said earlier, was quite traumatic for me. I had been deaf, remember, totally for 2 years before the implant was switched on. And getting to use, because I had speech memory, they said to me that that's why I should do well with the implant. However, I still had to learn to use the implant. For example, some things that I used to enjoy, like music, was different with the implant. I can dance to music because I can hear the bass notes, but I can't understand the words what they're singing. But then I'm led to believe normal hearing people find some records the same way. For me, I keep all my records that I had at that time because I remember what they sounded like. I can hear piano music well, or single instruments, but as I say, popular music, I find that difficult. I find listening to birdsong difficult because the birds sound different. Dogs barking, they have all got colds, all of them. But apart from those minor things to me, everything else I manage. I manage certainly with speech. I manage with speech on a telephone. And I was very pleased I was able to use a mobile phone because at the time that I went deaf, the mobile phones you had was like a brick that you had to carry around with you, with a big battery, and you could hardly hear. I could hardly hear with them. But since they brought out Bluetooth and things like that, I can use the standard phones now. So I'm pleased with that. So the process that I went through in learning to use my implant was a case of coming back and having the map adjusted. It was a case of having support in terms of the speech therapist that I saw. And it was also a time for me to have even more examinations to have a look to see how the implant had settled down. Because after a while, they do check on that to see everything is okay inside. And so it was a learning experience for me. But I'm very pleased. If anybody was in doubt of having an implant, I would always say go for it. Always, because although it's an individual thing, everybody's response to an implant can be different. I still believe, in my case certainly, the benefits that I've had far outweighs the potential risks and outweighs everything else.